Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over Game 8 from the 2013 Chess World Championships between Anand, the current champion, and the challenger Magnus Carlsen. Up until this point, Magnus Carlsen has a 2-point lead. He's won 2 of the games, and they've pretty much drawn the rest of the game. So we have a 12-game series, and going into game number 8, Magnus Carlsen definitely feeling like he has the advantage. Game number 8, White's going to be played by Magnus Carlsen, and Anand in this particular game is going to be playing the black pieces. Magnus Carlsen starts with e4, and then we see e5, something we've seen very frequently in this tournament. We see the Rai Lopez, and then we see the Berlin defense. Now, keep in mind, Magnus Carlsen has played the Berlin defense a few times already as black, and has had pretty good success with it. And so it looks like Anand has decided that, okay, well, maybe there's something to playing as black, playing the Berlin defense. So decided to go ahead and play it himself, knowing that he needs a very strong defense from black, because he needs some points, because there's only about 4 games left. 5 if you count this one left in the series, so he needs some points on the board because obviously he wants to reclaim his title. So after knight to f6, Magnus Carlsen has a few different ways to play. Very common has been this pawn to d3. Magnus Carlsen decides to go ahead and opt for the castling, and then after the knight takes, now to play this rook over here to e1. More common is just this knight here to d4. We saw this earlier in the tournament, but Magnus Carlsen decides to play the rook over here to e1. And you can tell that he's very comfortable with the Berlin defense. Not only does he play it a few times in this tournament as black, so he knows what to think about, but in this particular game, he was making all of his moves very, very quickly. Wasn't even really thinking about them. And pretty much what that means is you have all these memorized. You've gone through all these lines, and so that there's no thinking involved. Anand now decides to bring his knight back here to d6, and we see the knight capture on e5. Now it is possible, there's many variations. White could have opted for the exchange variation here, after the pawn takes, then we could have the knight take here if you wanted to get that pawn back in material, and then after the bishop comes to e7, because there's a discovered attack here, then the king can castle on the king side. This is going to be fairly good game. Also, black could decide if he wanted to castle on the queen side. First want to get his bishop out, and then queen here to d7 a little bit later. Could also castle on the queen side when you have this pawn here on c7 and c6. But Magnus Carlsen decided to instead just go ahead and take with his knight right here. And now the bishop's going to come here to e7. So both sides just kind of opening up this e-file, just going to attack that. Then the bishop's going to come back here to f1 again. Could have decided to go ahead and take here on c6. And then after the exchange, we've already kind of talked about it. Definitely not going to bring his bishop back here to c4. Most players, in this particular case in the Berlin defense, there's no real reason to go ahead and give up your bishop. So Magnus Carlsen just decided to bring that bishop back here to f1 for the time being. We now see Anand take with his knight on e5, and then Magnus Carlsen takes with his rook. Black decides to go ahead and castle on the king side. Didn't have the exchange over here, so it's going to be a little bit tricky for him to get this bishop involved into the game, get the queen involved, and then castle on the queen side. Decides to go ahead and take for the safer route to go ahead and castle on the king side. Now Magnus Carlsen is going to extend a little bit with his pawn here to d4, controlling this rook in the center. But again, just putting a lot of pressure on the center of the board. Black's going to have to play a few moves before he can counterattack with his own pawns. Decides to play this bishop here to f6, which not only attacks the rook, but also counterattacks this pawn here on d4. The rook just swings back here to e1, controlling this long file right here. Again, Magnus Carlsen has a small advantage. He is controlling, the center of the board with his pawn. He does have, his rook here on the e-file. But again, it's a very slim margin that he has as far as development advantage. Now the rook's going to swing over to e8, trying to just counterattack. Now Magnus Carlsen plays pawn to c3, strengthening his queen side over here, getting ready to get some of his other minor pieces involved into the game. Black decides to go ahead and just exchange a few pieces off, which is completely fine with Magnus Carlsen. The faster that he can exchange these pieces off the board, the faster he can get to an in-game state where he has been much stronger than Anand in this particular tournament, or it just gets to a point where he can just draw. And Magnus Carlsen, at this point in the tournament, he's thinking, hey, draws are fine. I'll just draw the rest of the games. I can even drop a game if I need to. That's going to be okay. I'll still be the champion. Anand, however, he definitely wants to go for the win. So you see that throughout this game, fighting for small incremental advantages. And so that's kind of what Anand's going for. Now the knight's going to swing back here to e8, kind of position himself a little bit better. The bishop's going to come out again, both sides just trying to get all of their pieces involved into the game and trying to put them in a better spot. So that's what we see. We actually see kind of a mirror over here on the queen side. So after the bishop comes involved into the game, we see pawn here to g6. A little bit breathing room for this king over here. Also, this bishop can move back. It's not going to be doing too much. This is kind of a blockade almost. There's no great squares for this bishop here on f6 to really do anything. And then after knight here to d2, knight over there to g7, the queen comes up, completing development for Magnus Carlsen. We now see Anand play this pawn to c6. So if we kind of look at the setup here, what both sides are looking to do, the queen side, not much is going to be happening over there. This pawn structure over here pretty much spells no action on the queen side. Now there could potentially be a nice little outpost for this knight here on c5. Could bring it over here to e5 if you wanted to, but that's pretty much all the action you would really see on the queen side. You could see some pawns pushing forward. If a lot of the pieces stay on the board, you could see some counterattacking later on the queen side. But for the most part, these are just set up to kind of have action on the king side. So both sides, Anand really wants to, use these outposts here on e4, on c4. He wants to control this long e-file. He wants to get his bishops involved into the game, see if he can attack over here, and then start to push the action. Magnus Carlsen now brings his rook over to e1. Both sides really have to control this e-file. Again, there's not much they can do besides control this e-file. Try to find some sort of weakness on the king side, but the queen side's pretty much useless for both sides. So now we see the bishop come to f5, again the last piece that, minor piece that Anand wants to get involved into the game. Magnus Carlsen, though, doesn't really care. He is okay with exchanging as many pieces as fast as possible as he can in this particular game, and so that's exactly what he does. So the knight takes. We now see the knight swing over here to f3. Wasn't going to do much here on c4 or e4, as you can imagine, and this really allows it to come to this outpost that we talked about here on e5. Can also come to g5, depending on what's on the board, so a lot of different options for that knight there. Now the knight's going to swing back here to g7, much better square for this knight. He can come to more active squares if he needs to. And so now we see the bishop come here to e5. Again, Magnus Carlsen just wants to continue to exchange as many pieces off the board. So now the knight's going to swing over here to e6. Again, better square for the knight there. And now Magnus Carlsen just exchanges pieces. Again, knowing that his opponent now has just 3 pieces, it's going to be very difficult for Anand to actually do anything productive in this particular game. Now we're going to see the knight come to e5. Again, a nice little outpost for that knight. The rook's going to swing over to e8. Needs to get involved into the game. This is definitely the best square for this rook. And now white plays knight here to g4. Very important move because it looks like it's just attacking this queen and opening up the e-file, which it does, those. But it's also a pretty dangerous trap move for Anand because throughout this game, there's so many different ways that Anand can play, and it's not going to be too bad. But after this knight here to g4 move, there's a lot of things that Anand can play that are actually going to be very, very difficult for him to overcome, and he can potentially lose the game because of it. For example, you might see queen here to g5, which looks a little bit more active. The queen was under attack, and so it still, protects this pawn here, or this square here on f6. Doesn't want to be too passive and bring the queen back, but unfortunately it does quite the opposite, because after the pawn comes here to f4, it forces this queen to move and move in a position where it's not going to be that great. So it can't come here to h6 because it's just going to be taken. It can't come here to h5 because then after the knight to f6, the queen's going to fall. So where does it really move? Let's say it moves back here to d8 now. Well, now this queen can come up here to e5, and this is very dangerous. The next move, this knight can come up here to f6, put a lot of pressure on the game, but because this square right here is now protected by this pawn, it's a little different. So if we come back in the particular game and we look at it, we see that the queen moved here to d8, and then we see the queen come up here to e5. Now it's very important for this knight to move back here to g7. There's no real great square besides this, for this knight to go to, or anywhere else for black to really move to, for that matter. But after we see the knight come here, let's say to f6, let's say the queen takes, this queen can't recapture because the rook's going to swing down here to e1 and the game's going to be over. But if we actually look at the particular situation a little bit different, let's say that queen had come here to g5, and now the pawn pushes forward, and now let's say this queen comes back here and the queen comes up here. Now this knight comes back here to g7. Now this knight can swing up here, but it's going to be different because let's say this queen now takes here on f6. Now after the queen takes, the rook can come down here on e1, but now there's an opening. Now the king can come here to f2. It's not going to be checkmate, and this is going to be very bad for Anand, as Magnus Carlsen now has this queen that can pretty much just go around and gobble up pieces. So very different, just because that one little move that forces Anand back gives some breathing room for this king. So it's very important in the exact game that Anand doesn't try to get too cute. Instead, in the particular game, after this knight comes here to g4, he immediately moves his queen back here to d8, so that now when the queen comes up, he can move his knight here to g7. But Magnus Carlsen has to be a little careful now because he doesn't want this rook coming down here to e1 checkmating, because this king can't move because of the back rank make. So hopefully you guys kind of understand some of these small little moves as far as what white does and how black responds and why he doesn't do certain things, because it can change big time based on small little moves. Magnus Carlsen decides to go ahead and take on e8. Again, he doesn't really have a whole lot of options. He can't really move his queen, or this, the rook's going to swing down here and back rank mate. So needs to go ahead and exchange. But again, this is what Magnus Carlsen wants to do. After the exchange, the rook takes here on e8, and after the queen, then we have the fork here on f6 that we kind of talked about. And so this queen's going to fall. So the king comes over and captured right here. And this is just pretty much an end game that no one can really do anything with. There's too many pawns on the board for any of the kings to ever move by. If there was another minor piece, especially a knight, this would be very, very good in this particular end game. But there's just no way for either side to kind of break through this. And so after 33 moves in the game, both sides decided to just go ahead and shake hands and draw and move on. So through 8 games, Magnus Carlsen still has a 2-game advantage. What's interesting is, in this particular game, Magnus Carlsen only used 20 minutes for the entire game, which is crazy because the World Championship's on the line. He has 2 hours for the first 40 moves, and then he gets an additional hour, and he used all of 20 minutes. Because, again, for the first few moves, he was just rapid fire. There was no thinking. It was all automatic. And then just got into a situation where all the action was on one side of the board, the king side. Magnus Carlsen didn't have to think too much. There weren't too many crazy variations. He was pretty much just trying to exchange as fast as possible. And it got into a situation where Anand just didn't have anything. Looking at the game, playing the Berlin defense showed that Anand wanted to try to find some advantage that his opponent had found in the Berlin defense. But Magnus Carlsen, it looked like just was too masterful of knowing both sides of what to do and how to find a very, very quick draw, and that's what he did. So going into Game 9, again, we have 4 games left. Magnus Carlsen has a 2-game lead. Hopefully you guys enjoyed Game 8, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.